Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. Hi, Elizabeth, Chris, Tina, and Joanna. Hi, Andre and Emily. Thanks for introducing yourselves. Craig, great to have you. We'll get started in about 4 minutes. I think we're just waiting for folks to trickle in. Hi, Lydia. Great to have you. You're in great company. There are a lot of former teachers here. Alrighty, I think we have a good group going. So I'm gonna get us started. Um, Feel free to keep introducing yourself in the chat. We'd love to hear where you're coming from and what's bringing you here today. Just a couple of things before we get started. Ripple's webinars are recorded, just so you know, and the recordings will be sent out to attendees and any folks that registered for the event. After the event, along with any supporting materials from today's session, so that includes the slides. And we'll also send out a quick feedback form that'll help us improve our webinars in the future. But when you do exit out of this webinar, you will be prompted to answer a feedback survey. And so if you could help us with that, that would be great. But in our webinar today, we encourage you to ask questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen throughout the presentation. Just to note that there is a Q&A portion at the end of the webinar, so the questions in the Q&A tab won't be answered until that time. And you can always see other people's questions. So if you have a similar question that's already been asked in the Q&A tab, feel free to upvote it so that we can source the questions that are most relevant to the audience here. But in the meantime, we do want to encourage you to share comments, thoughts, and reflections in the chat throughout the presentation, as you continue to engage with each other and our speaker, Nate. And then last note, because we are currently in Zoom's webinar platform rather than the classic meeting room, you will be muted and off camera for the entirety of the webinar. But if you would like to, when we get to the Q&A portion, if you'd like to unmute, feel free to raise your hand, and a team member of Ripple will unmute you so you can ask your question that way. So now that we're done with the housekeeping items, I'm going to turn it over to Nate Schwartz, who is the Director of Applied Research at the Annenberg Institute at Brown University, and the person who's been spearheading the build of Ripple's research infrastructure. So grateful to have you, Nate, and excited to learn more.
Thanks, Krista. And hi, everyone else, and welcome. I'm still watching the chat go by and seeing everyone is here. It's such an amazing group. I will try to leave lots of time for questions because I really would love to hear this group talk to each other, and hopefully we'll all be in a room together at some point rather than only in a Zoom room. So I'm the research chair of Ripple, and as many of you who've talked to me know, one of my soapbox topics is the difference between research studies and synthesis. I worked for a long time in the Tennessee Department of Education, and while I was there, we had this steady parade of researchers coming through to report their individual studies. But one of the things that we always found is we struggled to figure out how to build out research-aligned programs from those individual studies. And the thing that I think is really important here is that doing research alone isn't enough. The point of Ripple has always been to figure out how to turn what we're learning into actionable knowledge. So one of the things that we promised ourselves when we started this organization was that we would build in regular mechanisms and periodic checkbacks to check step backs to try and look across our portfolio and figure out what it all means. What are we actually learning? I also think that's always a challenge. And the way you get there isn't from one person. It takes a lot of people talking through findings, talking through their own work, and figuring out what it looks like to build these into practice. So what you'll hear today is kind of a first attempt to start on this synthesis. Here, we're trying to look across the various reports that we published, the in-progress research that's taking place, and the many conversations that we've had across our network to begin this sense-making process. And so please see it as a first draft, see it as an invitation for feedback. What you'll hear here now probably won't feel brand new, but hopefully it feels useful as a way of thinking about what is coming together here. And again, we'd love your thoughts on what needs further development. So first, the background, and that's the slide that you see in front of you now. As many of you know, RPPL was launched when a group of PL providers met together with a group of researchers in a joint discussion about the weakness of what we saw in the field of PL research. So it's not that there weren't lots and lots of studies of PL. There are lots of studies of professional learning, but most of those were looking at the overall effects of packages of professional learning within very specific contexts. They studied what were often small kind of boutique programs in one district, and they said, did this program make a difference or not? But it felt to us, and it felt to these PL providers who helped launch RPPL, like these studies weren't providing information about how to design new PL going forward. It was hard to think about how to generalize to a wider population. It was hard to understand what was happening for specific groups of teachers, for specific groups of students. And what we wanted RPPL to do was to think about how could we learn better about PL design features? And again, this sort of variation across specific contexts and populations. So if you go to the next slide, Krista, that launched this defining question of RPPL. What if the providers delivering PL in districts across the country could turn themselves into laboratories through sustained research practice partnerships to better study what PL design features work, for whom and under what conditions, to improve educational outcomes for historically marginalized students? Our hope is several years from now, as RPPL grows, we feel like we have really concrete answers to some of these questions. What does it look like to design strong PL? Where? What needs to change? How does this vary across organizations like yours? And so as we think about today, what we're learning, and now please do flip, Krista. We think we're starting to gather to build a knowledge base. We think we're starting to build a knowledge base about professional learning itself, but also about how to do better research. And so you'll hear two big sections to what I'm going to present today. One on what we know about professional learning, but the second about this kind of research infrastructure that we've been trying to build across RPPL. Because again, as all of you who have been involved in this know, it takes a while to build these studies, and we are slow to start up in a lot of them because we've been trying to figure out how do we build the infrastructure to do this work better and faster over time. And then I'll end by talking about what that means for our coming years. So if you move forward one. What are we learning about the PL knowledge base? We started actually, this was before I think RPPL was even fully baked, with this report that we called Dispelling the Myths. And what we started with was this idea that the consensus view of what works in PL isn't especially well supported by research evidence. So the consensus view often suggests that effective professional learning looks a certain way. It's focused on building teachers' content knowledge through long-term job-embedded structures that are particularly targeted toward building fidelity to a single model among those in the early stage of their career. Now, it's not that that is wrong, but when you look at the last 10 years, the last 5 to 10 years of PL research, we see some places that view is sort of weakened. We see that PL program effects aren't actually always concentrated among beginning teachers. There are a bunch of studies out there that show the real learning that can happen among veteran teachers, among those teachers who are long past that 5-year mark where people sometimes think of learning as plateauing. And we can see big gains and big improvements from the right PL. We can see that job embeddedness matters, but actually programs that sometimes give people time outside their job to develop their learning can also make a big difference. So programs that include explicit summer workshop time for teachers. They do this alongside some of the job embedded parts. But when you add that summer workshop time, you see on average much greater gains for students than when you're only doing things across the school year. There's a great set of studies about how to think about teacher fidelity to a particular set of programs. So these were studies where some teachers were just given a kind of an improvement plan and told, do this over the next 2 years. And then in others, they were trained on this plan, but then the second year they were told, okay, make it better yourself. There are a few things that are non-negotiable about what it is that you are doing and learning, but there's a lot that you know that whoever developed these, there were a series of interventions, but whoever developed these series of interventions probably aren't getting right. How would you make it better? And as you can imagine, there were much greater effects when teachers were given that sort of idea that adaptation and their adaptation was an important part of the learning process, rather than something that kind of pushed research aside, which is really relevant now as everyone's thinking about what does it mean to implement HQIM. And we also talked about in this myth-busting brief, this idea that shifts in content knowledge often actually don't make a difference to what goes on in the classroom. So there are really great PL opportunities out there that if you test teachers before and after the PL opportunity, if you give them the chance to sort of say what they have learned, they will claim huge changes in the way they think about their work. And often those changes aren't reflected at all in what they're doing in the classroom, and you don't see changes in student outcomes. And so thinking about the difference between what does it mean to shift content knowledge versus what does it mean to shift practice has become a big part of what we're doing at RIP. We went from here, thanks, Krista, to a second report where we tried to say, okay, so if the consensus view isn't quite right, what do we know? And there is a lot that we know about professional learning, not from Ripple studies, but again, from the body of knowledge that has grown up across the past decade. One of the most robust findings that we've seen is that instructional coaching can be an incredibly significant way of changing what teachers do in the classroom. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. But more what we see is this idea that if you can give teachers the right opportunities to check in across the course of what they're doing and to feel accountability and to feel like people are asking them, not only was this professional learning useful, but what have you done differently in the classroom because of it? That by itself starts to bridge this gap between content knowledge and instructional practice. And so the programs that seem to be the most successful are those that really focus on modeling, that focus on analysis, that focus on giving teachers the chance to rehearse and having them watch others rehearse. And you can do that through curriculum, you can do that through formative assessments, you can do that through video lessons. There are a whole bunch of ways that people build in this emphasis on actual practice. But what we're finding is that unless PL programs build in that emphasis on practice, practice tends to stay the same. And finally, just to call this out, this feels a little bit different than the other points on this slide. But we see that when PL programs include an explicit focus on what could teachers do to strengthen teacher-student relationships, that looks very different than the PL programs that are either only focused on sort of well-being, but not the relationship between the teacher and the student, or focused more on the academic side. It seems like this focus on truly thinking about how do you build relationships? What does it look like for a teacher to have empathy for a student and vice versa? Turns into adds the ingredients for truly effective PL. And so what we did, and you can see this on the left side of this slide, is we tried to think across all of these different points. And in this report, there are a whole bunch of different studies that we cite, but what do we know about effective PL in general? And we talked about this idea that there seem to be two kind of key points that link together all the individual studies that we cite. This idea that effective PL creates social accountability for shifting practice. So teachers feel like someone else is caring, someone else is watching, someone else is looking, and they feel it from their peers, they feel it from their instructional coaches, they feel it from their principals, this idea that there is actually pressure to change. And that the pressure to change is coming in the context of new improvements to what people know. So content that is built around teachers' day-to-day interactions versus built around this idea of abstract knowledge. This is where we started as Ripple. But then we launched, and no, Krista, you're right to change. Just move forward a slide. Then we launched into a new set of studies and to kind of broader discussion among our large team. So our large team, including all our district affiliates, including our PL providers, including our member organizations, to try to think about how do we build on this knowledge? And that's where we got to this idea that it feels like a real frontier that Ripple can help with is thinking about how best to personalize PL to meet individual needs. And when I say individual needs, I could mean teacher needs, but we're also talking about schools. We're talking about districts. We're talking about the needs of I don't know, a set of third grade teachers who are at a particular stage in the HQIM adoption cycle. And what we see here is that there are lots of ideas about how to do that and very little evidence on how to do it well. So Ripple is currently supporting an ongoing study by Leading Educators, a founding Ripple member, which suggests that teachers and leaders each have separate ideas about the types of data that should be used to identify PL needs. And this divergence leads to markedly different views about whether specific PL strategies are most useful or most appropriately adapted to schools and classroom contexts. Now, earlier I said one of our firmest research bases is about instructional coaching. We know that instructional coaching offers a sort of research-backed way to customize feedback. And when you've got this strong relationship between a teacher and a coach, the information that the coach is giving is not, standing in front of a classroom telling a whole group of teachers what to do. It is directed specifically toward the needs of that one teacher. But it's also kind of a black box for us right now. So when we've been talking to a lot of districts recently about the instructional coaching systems they put in place. And what you hear over and over again, and we've heard this from a lot of PL providers as well, is that they have very little way of thinking about how to standardize or what they should standardize within the elements of the coaching system. So coaches talk with teachers. Sometimes they do rehearsals. Sometimes they model certain things. But we don't have a common vocabulary to think about the elements of a coaching system. And Ariel Bogoslav, who presented in this last webinar, has just released for Ripple a really cool report that tries to create a common vocabulary, sorry, if you stay on the previous slide for one more second, Krista, that tries to create a common vocabulary for how to think about coaching. We are launching into a whole set of studies about coaching, so we hope to have more to say soon. But this feels like an area that the more that we can talk about, the more that we can think about the evidence base, the better off we're all going to be. Now, this speaks to, now if you go to the final slide, this speaks to the idea that districts have few templates or models to follow as they make decisions about how to allocate resources toward PL. Because the other problem with coaching, and in general with PL that tries harder to be tailored to specific needs versus broad, is that it's expensive, right? What we see from districts is that they are constantly cycling up and cycling down the amount of instructional coaching they have. And there's just not good guidance on it. If we know something about, and you can see it on this slide, we know something from another report that Ripple released about how much we're spending on PL. We're spending $37 billion annually. That's just a huge sum of money. But we're spending $37 billion annually on professional learning. And about 70% of that goes toward district staffing. But if you're ready to spend this amount, and so that's about $8,000 per teacher, how should you allocate this money? How many coaches as a district should you get? Which teachers should you target? How many other types of staff salaries should you be should you budget in there? And when does it make sense to contract outside help versus building this stuff in-house? And that guidance isn't the kind of guidance that I think research has given up until this point. And it's the kind of guidance that we really want Ripple to become stronger at. I will say that one kind of fascinating point to me here is that you can see it in this third bullet on this slide. There are big differences in spending patterns across districts. So not only do districts allocate different amounts of money toward kind of contracts versus in-house things that they do, but we just also see districts spend wildly varying amounts on professional learning. And my hypothesis was that we were looking over a kind of 20-year time period. My hypothesis was that over the last 20 years, we would see smaller differences within states in how districts were spending their money because states have taken a larger role in creating policy around professional learning. So I thought all the laws that have been passed around kind of how districts should do professional learning by states in the last, I don't know, 5 to 10 years would have constrained the variation in how districts are spending their money. It actually turns out that's not true at all. It turns out that within states, districts are varying more and more in their spending patterns rather than less and less over time. And so I don't think we know enough yet about why districts are spending money in certain ways and how to advise them to think about this question of personalization. And so these are the sets of questions that we're thinking about, but also the places where I think Ripple already knows more than we used to, and we're starting to build what feels like kind of a knowledge base around how to do this and around the kinds of questions that feel most useful. All of this is pointing us toward new and better research questions and new focus points for our work in the coming year. And that's where I'm going to go at the end of this talk. But before I do that, I want to talk about the other piece of this puzzle, which is how we can do this research better. And we're still figuring that piece out too, but let me give you a few sort of sample findings. Again, think about which pieces of this are most helpful to you, what you want to see. I can see coming through the chat a whole series of questions and requests for some of this, some of the citations that I'm just mentioning quickly. So we'll make sure you have all of that, and a lot of it is in these reports. But again, let us know what resonates most with you, and we will turn that into versions of this that we can share more widely. Okay, what are we learning about how to do research? So Ripple's model is built on the idea that we can do better research if we build collaborations that include multiple stakeholders: teachers, school and district leaders, PL providers, and researchers working across the PL system. And I'll just note, this is not the traditional model of research, right? Or it's not even the traditional model of research partnership, where a researcher identifies kind of a testable intervention, finds the right district to work with, and those site participants work together. What we've got these multiple levels. You can see it in terms of the human pyramid on this slide, which involve the people doing the PL, the organizations and the districts that are organizing the PL, and the researchers and Ripple that are trying to think about the broader set of research questions. And we think this model is enormously important in allowing us to have meaningful things to say about a PL landscape that is not either solely public or solely private, right? It includes vendor organizations, it includes districts, it includes states sometimes, and it needs to include researchers. And so that has allowed us to do kind of research that feels really different than what PL research traditionally looks like. We've recently been working on a study where teachers received similar reflection exercises across districts in rural Arkansas. suburban Texas, Chicago, and New York City. And thinking about what you could learn about a PL that unfolds in similar ways across very, very different contexts, I think does give us a different window into learning about PL. But these multi-level partnerships also break a lot, right? They break a lot because people are always turning over, and they break a lot because they require a different kind of coordination than we traditionally have across all these different parties. And so if you go to the next part of this slide, Krista, what we've been thinking about as an organization is that building investment in PL experimentation on a large scale remains a real challenge. So adding in additional partners requires more coordination to carry out all these studies. And we're still learning about how to build that buy-in. But I think one of the things that Ripple is trying to get better about, and this is where I'd be curious to all of you, whether this is this feels like the kind of thing that you need. But we're trying to get better at creating common languages and turning this into resources that all of you can use as well as us. So what is very small on this slide are just sort of pictures of different resources that we're starting to create at Ripple. The one on the left is a glossary of terms. So we have different ways of defining what do we mean by a randomized control trial? What is an A/B experiment? What does it mean when we talk about a nested experiment or when we talk about a unit of randomization? And we feel like if we can get people to understand these words, but also to think about, so why would you do them? When do these help? What do they answer? And how can we use these terms as a way of creating a community where we're all talking about research in the same way? And so on the right side, and I'm sure you can't read this at all, but on the right side of this slide, these are sort of sample answers to the kinds of questions that all of our partners receive as they are planning and launching research. So things like, what if we want to talk about doing a randomized controlled trial, doing the kind of study where some teachers receive an intervention and others don't? When is that justifiable, and what kind of answers could we give to partners who are saying, well, I'm not sure that we want that. I'm not sure that it makes sense to have certain teachers have access to something that other teachers don't. And we would talk about, yes, we agree with that if we think that the thing that the teachers are accessing is necessarily better. But sometimes we don't know. And randomized control trials can be a way of understanding that. But the broader idea here is that we're trying to create the shared language and the knowledge base to invest all of our partners and to create a community where we can all talk in the same way about this work. And I think the other thing that we're learning here, which I will just note quickly, is that we initially thought of this as the work that we were doing through Ripple as kind of a partnership between research teams across organizations. There would be researchers at Annenberg, for example. There would be the research team in a PL providing organization. We would get the research team within a district pulled into the meeting. And we would all hold a good meeting about, wouldn't it be neat if we could study this part of PL? And we all agreed it would be great. We would try to launch a study, and 9 months later, we'd still be far off from launching the study because it turned out that all these people who could see who could envision a great research project weren't the people who would actually be doing the work. And instead of those people, what we really needed was we needed the sales team from a PL provider organization to understand the conversation that they needed to have with a district partner as a contract was being built, so that this research could meaningfully be built into the way that the district did business versus feel like it was something on the side that everyone asked for permission about afterwards. And so the reason all of this shared language becomes important is that we were trying to think about, how do we invest the broader teams, the program teams within districts, the sales teams within PL providers, all of these groups, the teachers themselves, the principals, all of these groups who are vital to both the learning and to making sense of the learning, but who aren't necessarily the first people we turn to when we're talking about research. Next slide, Krista. The second piece is we've been thinking a lot about what does it mean to center equity in PL research. And I think we would all say, I hope we would all say, that the core work of Ripple, where we're trying to improve the effectiveness of professional learning with a focus on teachers who serve students from historically marginalized communities, is by its nature grounded in equity, right? This work matters because we are trying to give students, and especially students who have been pushed to the sides of our education system, better experiences. And our Ripple partners, our affiliates, our districts have all thought about what it means to support these groups of students and to prioritize diverse viewpoints. But I think what we haven't figured out yet is how to routinely build this awareness into our research designs. So how can we design research that acknowledges diverse expertise? How do we make sure that the research isn't just being done to people, but all the right people are being pulled into this sense-making conversation that we're having today? How do we ensure that power and prestige imbalances don't silence important voices? One of the things that we just did, and you'll hear more about this too, but one of the things we just did within our Ripple community is we ran a request for a grant process, a request for proposals, where all of our Ripple members and affiliates were offered the chance to compete for some funding to run their own research studies with focused on certain criteria. And one of the things we asked in this RFP was, what does it look like to you to build equity responsive research into your process? How are you going to make sure that this particular study is both serving the needs of the neediest students, the neediest teachers, but also how are you going to make sure that as you're having these conversations, you're making sure they are participatory in all the right ways? And we saw tremendous variation across the responses for this RFP. Some proposals ignored this section of the RFP entirely, or appeared to sort of just equate equity with diversity and representation. Others highlighted particular frameworks, but didn't explain how would they operationalize that framework in their research. And what we've been thinking a lot about across and many of them were very strong, but again, just used completely different language for this. So looking across those proposals, we see a real opportunity to build common language as a network around what it means to carry out genuine equity-centered research in the PL space. And we're hoping to use this set of proposals that we received as a launching point for a broader discussion about the research processes that are most likely to help us achieve our aims as a network. Okay, a third point here. This is kind of this. I feel like researchers always say this: measurement matters. And so I'm sorry to say it again, but this has been one of our huge takeaways from the past couple of years of Ripple, which is that measurement matters, and the way that our different organizations and our different districts and our different researchers are all going about the process of gathering data about professional learning is not aligned in a way that is allowing us to take advantage of that to build a knowledge base for the field. So what we started actually by convening this group of partners to talk about their within all of their organizations, what did they do to measure their own effectiveness? What were their frustrations with that? What was it that they hoped to see from research tools that they weren't yet getting? And these organizations were all very clear that the validated tools that researchers were pushing for gathering data about PL were not aligned to their needs. They weren't aligned to school partner needs. They didn't allow you to measure improvement over time in the ways that they wanted to. They weren't sort of built for continuous improvement. They often weren't designed to incorporate questions of equity in practice and in practices and equity in student experiences. And they just took a long time, right? They were there were sort of these long surveys or suggestions about how to gather data that weren't really helpful for the kind of work that actually goes on in schools. And so what came about as a result is that all of these organizations felt like they actually consciously traded rigor for usability, that they would do a whole bunch of stuff, they'd gather a whole bunch of data, but they never felt very good about that data because survey response rates were low, because they didn't feel like what they were doing was validated in a meaningful way. And so we, as a Ripple organization, have started a real process to try to think about what would it look like to gather common data across organizations and across districts that we can all feel confident tells us enough about what we care about to allow us to compare apples to apples instead of apples to oranges. And so if you go to the next slide, Krista, this is another slide where I've got a tiny picture here in front of you, and I don't expect you to read this, but I want to describe this process because I think it's been really neat. So the process that we've had is we've had a PLC working within Ripple that has come together to try to say, for a small slice of the work that we do, and this was thinking about organizations that were all working on implementing HQIM, high quality instructional materials, in kind of early to middle grades literacy. Can we all agree on certain things that connect to each other that would allow us to measure professional learning in a different way? And so they thought about, what would it look like? What are the constructs and subconstructs to think about whether or not high quality instructional materials are a core part of the instructional culture? What would it look like to know whether teachers are, what parts of teachers' implementation of HQIM do we want to measure and how? What do we want to measure about teachers' belief and mindsets? What do we want to measure about students' engagement and their academic outcomes? And what we've done is we've agreed, these organizations have all agreed together to certain subconstructs that they all care about equally and all want to measure. And then we've done this process where we did a research lit review and said, what are all the tools that you could use to measure these subconstructs? We went to all our organizations and said, what are all the tools you're already using to measure these subconstructs? And right now we're voting basically on how can we turn this into a set of common measurements versus something that we all do in a different way. And so in the next few months, one of the things that Ripple will be releasing is this, what we're going to call a kind of a measurement package, a package of things that we would love for all of us to be measuring, and to be measuring in a way where then we can say across different districts, across different PL organizations, across different types of professional learning, do we see similar things, or do we see very, very different things? And more to come on this, but I think this common measurement scheme is actually one of the things that will allow us to do a very, very different kind of research as an organization. One last point about research and the kinds of resources we're building as an organization. So this isn't, I don't think, going to be surprising to anyone here, but ownership of professional learning data can be ambiguous and requires coordination and approval from multiple partners. So because the professional learning market, I guess you could call it, is so fragmented, right? It lives with PL organizations, it lives with districts, it lives sometimes with the state. There are a whole bunch of people all collecting data about professional learning, and these aren't the same group, the same organizations, and it's hard to. These aren't necessarily governed by FERPA, right? This isn't student data a lot of the time, but it is data that multiple organizations feel ownership of, and that usually doesn't end up in the same place. And so it has become very, very clear to us that the agreements that we need to have in place to do this research, which can come through contracts, which can come through data sharing agreements, but those agreements need to include all of the parties that are going to be using this data for improvement purposes, which it can include the research teams, which can include districts, which sometimes include states, and which sometimes includes PL providers. And so another resource that we're just developing is a set of agreements that feel very standardized, that are tri-party agreements. So 3-party agreements where all of these partners can sign on and say, we agree to share the professional learning data across all of our organizations for the purposes of improvement. and here's what that will allow, and here's what it looks like to share that data for research purposes. Here is how we will protect that data and make sure that it doesn't get out in the wrong ways. And so, again, this is a resource that we'll just make available on our Ripple website eventually for those that want templates for this stuff so that we aren't all reinventing the wheel each time. So with that was kind of a lightning run through of a set of learnings that, again, are somewhat disconnected, but I think can come together and create what feels like the knowledge base for Ripple. So where do we go from here? I just wanted to give you a quick glance at what we're seeing on this in the submissions that our districts our partners are sending to Ripple as the questions that they want to focus on. And so if you go to the next slide, we just ran our first RFP competition, and it is very, very clear that our members and affiliates are asking crucial questions that have the potential to deepen learning across the network. And so what you will see from us across the next couple of years is you will see, I think, this shared measurement system, but you'll also see a bunch of studies that focus on these points that I was just talking about, where it feels like we know something and we need to know more. So we saw a bunch of proposals about building stronger and more empathetic teacher-student relationships. And so one of these studies is asking, how can we help math teachers build their capacity to take on the perspectives of their students? Another asks, how can we support teacher collaboration aimed at deepening relationships to build student academic identities? We are seeing a bunch of questions about individualizing professional learning to teacher and student needs. One study that we'll be funding asks, what sequence of coaching supports works best for new teachers? Another asks, how can coaches supplement high-quality instructional materials with specific just-in-time information about student misconceptions? And kind of unsurprisingly, and I didn't talk about this very much today, but we're seeing a lot of questions and a lot of work on how to expand the use of technology to support high-quality instructional materials. So many of our organizations are working deeply in the generative AI space to think about how and when AI can best scale PL opportunities, and to think about this kind of what it looks like to create a complementary relationship instead of a substitute relationship between what you can do with technology and what you can do with humans, where facilitators and coaches are most useful, and where there are ways that some of these new technologies can do some of the work of providing feedback so that our staff members can provide the types of feedback that can only come through individual relationships. All to say, it's an exciting time for Ripple. We are so glad to have this many people, and I'm just looking at the audience of the webinar now, this many people who can join us on this journey and push us to both synthesize learning in new ways for all of you so that you can take it up in your own organizations, but also ask better questions. And so with that, I am going to turn it over to Krista, who I think will lead us through a Q&A period.
Alrighty, so I'm going to look through the questions in our Q&A, and feel free to ask as we're going through them, but let me start from the oldest to the most recent. Okay, so Laura is asking, wondering what evidence you've seen around how educator mindset and disposition impact shifts in content knowledge and practice.
That is such a great question, Laura. It's such a great question in part because it's been a big topic of conversation for us, and I'm not sure that we have great evidence on it yet. But so what we know is and I guess I'm not sure exactly what you mean by educator mindset, but the way that we've talked about this in Ripple is that there's a lot of evidence that teachers can set very, very different expectations for different types of students. right? The TNTP opportunity myth does a really good job describing some of this sort of expectation problem and mindset problem and what it can mean for the types of work that students are given in the classroom. And the debate that we've been having as a group is thinking about how do we think about shifting mindsets in meaningful ways to ensure that teachers are working across students and across student groups and keeping expectations high, even when we know that that is not always happening right now. And one of the beliefs is that if we do this, if we focus only on mindsets, or one of the concerns is that if we focus only on mindsets, we won't see these practice changes. So, right, I said at the beginning of this, often when you shift teachers' content knowledge alone, you don't see shifts in instructional practice. You could make the same argument about mindsets. We could have a whole kind of mindset intervention, a way of trying to change what teachers think, and it might or might not change what is going on in the classroom. And so I think the other argument is, no, let's just focus on things like the materials teachers are using. Let's make sure they are setting equal expectations across their classroom and across schools, because they all are working from the same textbooks, the same materials, the same scripts, even potentially. And that's the way, then once they see that students can do this type of work, their mindsets will shift alongside that. And this is we've been trying to figure out how to do that study in the right ways. We've done sort of small versions of it and don't have good findings yet, but it's the right question and one that we'd like to talk about more.
Thanks, Laura, for your question. I'm just gonna flag this for the Ripple team that the link to the article about describing common elements of instructional coaching was asked for twice. We will get that to you all once it's publicly available.
Krista, that actually is publicly available. It's a working paper right now, but it is up on our Ripple Publications site as I think the top article.
Gotcha. Okay, Elizabeth is asking, thanks for your data question. 70% of the 37 billion spent on district staffing. What is meant by district staffing in that reference?
Yes, good question, Elizabeth. We are working on a report on this. We don't have a report yet. We do have the last webinar where Ariel goes into much more detail about exactly what this study looks like. And so that video is up on our site as well if you want to see it. But the quick answer is that so we're using a national data set where districts report the spending they do on professional learning. And professional learning there is defined in very, very specific ways. But it is not defined. We aren't talking about teachers' time. We aren't talking about teacher stipends. What we're talking about there is we're talking about district professionals who are delivering professional learning to teachers.
Alrighty. And someone asked, can you say more about the follow-up you did with organizations that submitted RFPs that maybe skipped that portion or have a seemingly misunderstanding of leading with equity-centered practices? Did they get referred somewhere? Is there a chance for learning more about how to go deeper in their equity journey?
Yes. The answer is, I was cautioned here because we are mid-process in terms of where we are with this RFP. We just got these submissions. We just, in the last week or so, I think, picked these the final winners of this RFP. And more, I think the public announcement is coming in the next week or something like that. I'm probably getting the timeline slightly wrong, but something close to that about who has won. And Dr. Camilla Davis on our team is doing this follow-up and thinking a lot about how do we support organizations to both strengthen their RFP submissions, but also just how do we think about this equity journey in a real way. And she's supporting all of our teams on that. So more to come on that soon, I guess is the answer.
We have an AI question. Do you see promise in AI to meaningfully support measurement practices. I've heard ideas about AI looking at student work, for instance. Are you all engaged in pilots or in discussion about opportunities and risks?
Yes, we are. What that looks like for us right now is it looks like a few of our researchers are working directly in this area. So Heather Hill, Jing Liu, Dora Dembski are all researchers kind of across the country who are working with Ripple to think about basically recording either classroom or coaching conversations and using those recordings to or using machine learning, using AI to tag and code those recordings in different ways and think about what's going on and how does that simplify and make easier the data that we collect so that we don't need to have observers in classrooms all the time. We are similarly, we're working with so we're working with organizations to try and think about AI for looking at student work and trying to see change in classroom in what's going on in the classroom based on the kind of work that students submit. This is really great work that EdLight is doing. And we're doing some of this on the Edinburgh side too. We've also just done kind of a scan of all of our organizations to try to understand what are they doing in the AI space and how are they thinking about AI for their professional learning initiatives, and more to come on that soon. We should also drop EdLight into the chat. I'm seeing what Hannah Rosenstein just put in about
Empowering teachers.
Lou and Dora Dembski, and EdLight is also doing some very cool work in this space, as are many of our organizations, but specifically on the measurement side of it.
Absolutely. Also kind of a measurement question. I'm wondering, Lydia's asking, I'm wondering about the relationship component that a couple of folks mentioned in the chat earlier as essential for learning. Are the measures for the quality of relationships within the school and system conditions or the teacher beliefs and mindsets?
Yeah. There are these types of measures, and the reason I'm hesitating is I'm probably not the right person to answer just off the bat, how good are they and which ones do we recommend? So I think that this package that we're starting to pull together will have some measurement of these relationships. And I think that there are places that do this well, right? Like I've had long conversations with the California Core District organization about how to measure these relationships. Bob Balfans at Johns Hopkins does really good work on this and thinking about school connectedness. But I don't know off the top of my head which of these measures I would say we all should be using as Ripple. And I guess, just have to say more to come there.
Yeah, and that's part of, the measurement work that Nate mentioned earlier. So thank you for your question, Lydia. More to come. And then Pamela, there's like a two-part question. I don't know if you're familiar with ICU Care, the framework, Nate, but Pamela is wondering if that might help in centering equity in PL research. But also, could the mismatch between researchers in schools result from not being in agreement in how we measure student success?
Yes, I would say very much so to the second part about mismatches and how we measure student success. I don't think that's only a mismatch between researchers and schools. Like I think that mismatch happens between different people in schools. That mismatch happens between policymakers and people at different levels of the educational system. But I think that absolutely drives part of what we're talking about. I don't think that's a problem that Ripple is going to solve, but I think at least the place that we can be helpful is we can say, here are a series of measures we can use. I'm not familiar with ICU Care, but I will become familiar with it. I'm excited.
All right, I'm looking at the time here. We have about 5 minutes and 3 questions left, just so you're aware, Nate. Rebecca is asking, I'm interested to know if you have any ways to examine the differences in structure, implementation, or impact between district-run / in-house PL versus outside provider facilitated PL.
Yeah, that's where we want this landscape work on how districts are funding PL and what they're spending on. That's where we want it to go. So we're doing kind of a deep dive into particular states and trying to make sense of what people are contracting for versus what they aren't contracting for, which will, I think, will start to get us to this idea of not just what percentage of money are people spending on in-house versus external, but what are they doing with that money differently, and what do they seem to be getting from the external versus the in-house. So I don't know exactly how to examine the difference in this. We're trying to figure it out. If other people are doing studies of this type, we would love to think about how to collaborate.
And with that, I'm just going to show our final slide here. If you want to collaborate and connect, here's some information on how to do that. I did want to see if we could fit in these last two questions from Dr. Dion Brown from one of our affiliate organizations, City Teaching Alliance. She's asking, is there any differentiation parsing out being done around the types of instructional coaching that exist in districts and which are effective for what, when, and for whom?
Yes, I think this is the area that both we saw the most proposals for studying from our RFP process. We've been having conversations with a series of districts about trying to study this work differently and better. And there are lots of people across the country also doing great work on this. I don't think there is enough known yet to start that synthesis process that I was talking about. So I think this is the area where Ripple will have kind of failed if we don't, in the next couple of years, have something real to say about the types of instructional coaching that exist in districts and which are effective for what, when, and for whom. And it's not that there's nothing, right? A different project at Annenberg, our Ed Research for Action project, has released a design principles brief about instructional coaching that I will throw into the chat as well, because I do think that is useful and kind of goes deeper into the research to not just say, here is what we it doesn't just say instructional coaching works. It says, here's what we know about models of instructional coaching that work and why they work. But it's not enough yet. And so I think there will be more on this as well. And it's an area that Ripple wants to get into.
All righty, and our last question is from a new affiliate organization, Avid. Dennis is asking, I'm wondering about ideas for getting a sense of PL impacts using a retrospective research design where observing classrooms isn't an option.
Great question, Dennis. Yeah. There have been lots of studies that do this, right? And some of them use student test scores, and some of them use, right, various other potential outcomes like I don't know, anything from student attendance to teacher retention to I think actually the bigger problems with retrospective research designs tend to be causality. So figuring out, having a retrospective research design where you feel like the change that you see, you can feel confident that that change came about as a result of the PL versus as a result of other things. And again, that's partly about the design of how the PL was rolled out, but it's partly getting at your point too here about outcomes, where the outcomes aren't proximal enough. They aren't close enough to the PL for you to feel confident that they were shifted by the PL versus some other thing. So I would, if this is something you want to talk more about, please connect with us. I would love to talk more about it. It feels like the right question, and we are, I think the answer is the studies that are done like that don't feel as informative as we would like them to be.
Right, I want to be mindful of time. It is 2 now. On behalf of the Ripple team, well, that Nate is also part of. A huge thanks to Nate Schwartz for an informative session, and thanks to all of you for joining us today. On your way out, if you could let us know what you thought of today's webinar, as we're always hoping to improve, and keep an eye out for today's recording and the session slides. But again, thank you all for attending, and thanks to the Ripple team as always.
Thanks, everyone.